Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for joining me. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Amanda Devison, and I am the Vice President of Business and Professional Women of Greater Moncton. And this evening, what I wanted to talk to you guys about is Black history in Atlantic Canada. So let me just see here. I'm just going to check to see. It says I'm live, but I can't. Okay, good. Sorry about that. So in terms of business and professional women, we started this conversation series during COVID because obviously we have to spend a lot of time apart, but there was a lot of incredible women and a lot of incredible topics for and about women that we wanted to make sure got out there during this time. And it's really helping us to connect and share those stories. So February is Black History Month, as I'm sure most of you are aware. And in terms of, well, why should you listen to Amanda talk about Black history? Well, I'm going to get into that now, actually. So come along on a journey with me. So this gentleman right here is my great-grandfather. He came from Barbados in the early 1900s. There was a big push on at that time for the steel plant and the coal mines in Cape Breton were trying to attract people from the West Indies. They could handle the heat better in those conditions. And so my great-grandfather decided to move to Nova Scotia from Barbados. Here's a picture of my grandfather and my grandmother. And they're standing in front of the house they built. So at the time, it was still difficult for Black Canadians to get mortgages and bank accounts and things like that. So my grandfather actually helped form a co-op with other Black residents in the area, and they actually build their own housing. So this is the picture of my grandfather and my grandmother standing in front of the house they built together in Whitney Pier in Cape Breton, and that photo was featured in the local newspaper. Here's another picture of them later in life. This gentleman here is my dad. So as you can see, he's very tall and very white. And this picture here is my mom. She's in the yellow shirt on the right. This is when she was training to become a teacher. She was one of the first Black teachers in Cape Breton. And so obviously that wasn't that long ago. So it's a very short period of time here. This is another picture of my dad and my mom. So as you can see, my mom is quite short. My dad is quite tall, and anyone who knows me knows I'm quite short. So the reason I bring all this together is just to give you guys an idea. So when you mix the genes of my dad and my mom, you will get this very 80s picture of my sister and I with the Cabbage Patch Kids. And yes, we have the same parents, and just I genetically take after my mom's side of the family, and my sister genetically takes after my dad's side of the family. But all this to say is that I am personally biracial, and so Black history has always been very important to me. And so that's why I decided I wanted to come on tonight and share this with you. And actually this presentation I actually put together and shared with a couple of different groups. So at work, so I've shared it with my own commercial financial services team at RBC, as well as the auto finance team. So I'm very happy to kind of bring it here tonight, and kind of hopefully you guys will be able to learn a thing or two about Black history that perhaps you didn't know before watching. So first I want to talk about Black History Month in general, so the actual celebration of Black History Month. So it's really meant to be a celebration of achievements and contributions of Black Canadians that they've made throughout history, and it's about recognizing the resilience and innovation throughout that time, and how diversity is very important throughout Canada and throughout the world. So in saying that, you know, I wanted to give some context, because a lot of times we talk about how diverse and multicultural we are here in Canada. So some people take for granted and think a lot of these things have been going on for a very long time, when in fact, the actual celebration and legal recognition of Black History Month has not been happening for a very long time. So in Canada, the very first, back in 1978 in Toronto, the Ontario Black History Society was established. In 1979, the first ever Canadian proclamation of Black History Month was issued by the city of Toronto. In 1988, in Nova Scotia, the first Black History Month was celebrated in Nova Scotia, and they later renamed it African Heritage Month in 1996. In 1993, Ontario proclaims February as Black History Month, and the Ontario Black History Society starts introducing the idea of having Black History Month recognized across Canada. So right now at this point in 1993, Ontario is the only province in Canada that has declared that Black History Month is February. In 1995, the House of Commons officially recognizes February as Black History Month in Canada, following a motion by Dr. Augustine, who was a famous Black Canadian as well. So the motion unanimously carries. So as a lot of us probably are familiar with now, given all the goings on with the US election and the various things that happened there, we as well in Canada have multiple levels of government. So in 1995, the motion passed in the House of Commons, but it didn't actually go through the Senate until 2008. So the motion went in front of the Canadian Senate in 2008 to recognize the contributions of Black Canadians and recognize February as Black History Month. So the actual lifespan of Black History Month in Canada is actually very short and wasn't formally put in place through government in the Senate until 2008. In that motion that was made in the Senate of 2008, I just literally highlighted here some of the various Black Canadians that were recognized during that. I'm not going to read out this slide. It was just to kind of give an idea of a variety of different people that were mentioned, from the first Black medical doctor to television producers to the lieutenant governor in Canada, just a variety of different roles, and why it was important that Canada decide to recognize Black history formally and on an annual basis. So now I want to talk about a symbol you may see, may have seen throughout February, and if you see it in the future, you'll know what it means. So this is the Pan-African flag. It's also called the Marcus Garvey, the UNIA, the Afro-American, or the Black Liberation flag. So it was actually raised in 6 cities across New Brunswick this year. So I know in Moncton, I believe in Dieppe, Riverview, and a few other places, they actually raised this flag in front of City Hall. So the red represents the blood which unites all people of Black African ancestry and the blood that was shed for their liberation. Black is for the people whose existence as a nation, though not a nation state, is affirmed by existence of the flag. And green is symbolic of the abundant and vibrant natural wealth of Africa. So it was designed by Marcus Garvey. That is why it's often called the Marcus Garvey flag. And it was brought to fruition because there was a recognition that there was plenty of people from African descent, but due to slavery, they were spread across the world, and they didn't really have a flag that represented them as a people. And so this flag came into being. So now I want to switch gears and talk about actual Black history in Canada. So a lot of what I'm going to tell you about, I tried to keep it very Atlantic Canada focused, since that's where we are. I think it's important to recognize that most people think it was always celebrated, as we just kind of talked about. It wasn't always the case in Canada. If you think back to your social studies classes, I'm sure you can probably have very little mention of Black history and Black contributions and the Black Loyalists that came here after the American Revolution. There was a lot of people settled in the Maritimes from Africa. So there's a lot of gaping holes, similar to what we see with Indigenous history. Hopefully, for those of you that have children, hopefully now some of that is changing depending on the school boards. And if not, then perhaps those are conversations you can be having with your schools and the school boards about adjustments that may need to be made about what is represented as Canadian history, so that it's not entirely white Canadian history. So one of the first Black people recorded in Canada was Matthew DaCosta. He was a navigator and interpreter, and he actually came over here with Samuel de Champlain. He was brought with them to explore the New World. They wanted him to interpret French and Micmac, and he actually, I believe, spoke 5 or 6 different languages. He's the first free recorded Black person to arrive in what is now known as Canada, and that was back in the early 1600s. So obviously before that, I don't believe there would be, record keeping wouldn't exactly be stellar, but he was in fact the first free Black person recorded. And it's actually also interesting to notice that this is before slavery was legal in America, what is now the United States, and in Canada. So his visit here actually predates slavery. So one of the other common misconceptions a lot of Canadians have is that there weren't slaves in Canada, and that only happened in America and elsewhere in the world. And that is actually completely untrue. In the country we live in today, there were Black and Indigenous slaves. Um, and sometimes they were called indentured servants, but their lives were no different than that of slaves. Like it wasn't like there were certain levels, and if you were an indentured servant, that your life was better than that of a slave. Some people just kind of named it differently, perhaps to kind of give it a little bit of a spin. But there were, in fact, slaves in Canada. We will touch on that a bit as the presentation goes on. So as we talked about in the 1600s, Matthew da Costa was the first recorded Black person to come to Canada. In 1628, Olivier Lejeune, my apologies for my en français, so he was recorded as the first enslaved African to live in Canada, and this was in the Maritimes. He was a young boy. I believe he was sold 5 or 6 times. He was eventually purchased by a priest. That is not his actual name. When he was purchased by the priest, he was baptized and given that name. I believe the priest's name was Olivier, hence why the slave's name was Olivier as well. And I believe he was actually technically an indentured servant. So that was back in 1628. In 1689, King Louis the 14th of France gave permission to all colonists of the New World that they were permitted to enslave Pawnee Native Americans and Africans. So that was the law of the land, is that if you were a colonist here, you could have Indigenous or Black slaves. 1749 to 1782, most of the Black people brought to Nova Scotia were enslaved by English and American settlers. So if you arrived in this area and you were a person of color, it was so that you could be a slave to English or American settlers. 1750, there were approximately 400 enslaved and 17 free Black people living in Halifax. In 1767, there were 104 free Black people living in Nova Scotia. So it's important to know back in 1700s, what was Nova Scotia then also includes what is now New Brunswick, a PEI. So those 3 provinces were considered Nova Scotia at that time. So there were approximately 104 free Black people living in that area. In 1775 and 1783, the British offered freedom to enslaved Africans if they joined in the British side against the Americans in the war for the American independence. So there was a lot of Black slavery in the States. So the British came in and said, if you join our side and we win, we will give you your freedom. So that happened at that point in time. In 1784, Canada's first race riot took place, and that actually happened in Shelburne, Nova Scotia. So startling, I'm sure. Also, to give a little more context to the birthplace of most Black Canadian history is Nova Scotia, or what is now, I guess now the Maritimes, and that is because of our access to the ocean. So there was a lot of people coming into the country through that area. So a lot of Black history for Canada starts in the Maritimes and then moves west over time. In 1790, approximately 1,200 Black Loyalists were dissatisfied with the conditions in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So back earlier, where we talked about the British who offered them their freedom, they won and gave them their freedom, they shipped them off to what is now Nova Scotia and New Brunswick to live there. And in fact, the conditions were so poor that they accepted an offer from the Sierra Leone Company, which was a British anti-slavery organization, to resettle back in Africa. So 1,200 loyalists, Black loyalists got back on ships in 1790 and went back across the ocean to Africa to resettle. And of course, not all of them lived. So you need to think about what was the context. What was it like to be a Black person living in Nova Scotia or New Brunswick in 1790, where you had already come from slavery. So you fought in a war to get your freedom. You are brought to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick to live a free life. And the conditions are so poor that you get back on a ship to go back to Africa, where obviously that is where your life was uprooted originally. And you were more than likely kidnapped, bought or sold, and brought back over the ocean to be a slave in America to begin with. So it must have been quite the experience. Apparently there, and that was one of many trips. There were several trips throughout time of Black Canadians going back to Africa. And apparently if you go to Sierra Leone now in Africa, there is like a Nova Scotia flair or feel to some of the things there. There's still a bond between when the people were in Nova Scotia at that time. They brought back some of the traditions or flavor per se back to Sierra Leone. To this day, it still exists. 1793, the anti-slavery movement was emboldened by the actions of Chloe Cooley. So Chloe Cooley was actually an Upper Canadian Black woman, and they were trying to sell her and send her back to the United States, and she was resisting being transported back to the States. And so a lot of people gathered around at that time to support anti-slavery movements. So it started to pick up steam a little bit, started to become more of a conversation piece throughout Canada. And between the 1800s and 1865, there was a number of historic Black communities established across Canada. So as I spoke about before, a lot of it started in the east and moved west. So at this time, it started the migration. Also, there seemed to be more people coming into the communities that did exist. Also during this time, approximately 30,000 Black people arrived in Canada via the Underground Railway. So a lot of people, that's where a lot of Canadians focus on that, on the fact that we were a hub for freedom for Black people through the Underground Railway, and we were, but that doesn't mean the existence of Black people in Canada was great to begin with, as we saw previously, and as we shall see moving forward. But that is obviously a high point in Canadian history, is that they were able to come here through the Underground Railway. In 1807, Britain outlawed the participation in the Atlantic slave trade throughout its empire. So it's important to note that this doesn't mean they said you can't have slaves. It meant that they didn't want people in the British Empire actively participating in the slave trade. So it was kind of one of those, put the blinders on if you already had slaves, or if you were trading, buying and selling slaves on the down low. Nobody really said anything about it, but they didn't want to see British ships and British people at the different ports buying and selling slaves. 1815, so the Black veterans of War of 1812 received land grants. So the offer was if they served in that war, they would receive land when they got back. A lot of them never did receive that land when they got back. A lot of them, it was about a quarter of it, I think, only a quarter of them received the land. Most of it wasn't agriculture. They couldn't grow anything on it. They couldn't have animals graze on it. It wasn't really useful land. And so they had to find employment in other places. And so obviously back in the 1800s, if you're a person of color, there's not really a lot of employment opportunities. And again, so this again echoes a lot of what we discover about Indigenous land, where a lot of the reserves that exist today are not on the land that they originally were on, that when as white Canadians came in, they wanted that land because a lot of it was along the water, a lot of it was farmland, a lot of it was very important trade routes. And so they uprooted the Indigenous and moved them to where the reserves are now, which is less than ideal locations for most of the communities. So similar things happened in the 1800s. So again, a lot of promises were made to those serving this war. We'll give you land. Unfortunately, the land that was given to them wasn't useful land, and also it was very small in size compared to what was given to their white counterparts. So they received a fraction of the land. Not everyone received their land, and they couldn't actually do anything with that land. In 1815, a lot of Nova Scotia's Black communities were reinvigorated after World War XII. So the veterans of that war, a lot of people came in. There was an influx of Black Canadians to Nova Scotia's Black communities. In 1834, so the Act of the Abolition of Slavery in the British Empire abolished enslavement in most British colonies, including Canada. So they actually passed it in 1833, but it didn't become law until August 1st of 1834. So you may have heard, especially now with the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of things that have been happening in the media since then, a lot of conversation moving forward. A lot of people refer to Emancipation Day. So Emancipation Day is August 1st, 1834. That is when slavery became illegal in the British Empire. And a lot of people feel that for Black people of Black ancestry, it's more of an important day than, say, your Canada Day or your Independence Day, because when those have started, Black people didn't have the same rights and freedoms as their white counterparts. So it's not really they weren't considered people. They were still considered property at that time. So to celebrate a country of when you were considered a whole person, that a lot of people feel that the August 1st date is more suitable for that point in time. In the 1850s, two important abolitionist newspapers were founded in Canada and supported the global anti-slavery movement. In 1858, nearly 800 free Black people left the oppressive racial conditions of San Francisco and found new life on Vancouver Island. And in 1879, a significant number of Black people started immigrating to Alberta from Oklahoma, but they did have to contend with attempts to prevent Black immigration. So when I'm speaking about that, I'm talking about Canada's immigration policy. So it was severely restricted the immigration of Black people to Canada. It was what was considered a white-only immigration policy, and this actually stayed in place until the 1960s. And actually, even then in the 60s, it wasn't like suddenly it was a light switch and there was a aha moment and everything was great for people of color to try to come to Canada. In fact, in the 60s, there was a big promotion for women in the Caribbean to move to Canada on the condition that they would basically be servants, that they would be housekeepers and nannies for white people living in Canada. So again, well, in the 60s, the white only, and this would be similar to a lot of what we heard about, when the Muslim ban took effect in the United States and Trump was very anti people of color immigration, but was okay with European immigration into America. That's very similar to what this would be at that point in time. Thankfully for us, it happened back in 1911 to the 60s and not in, in 2020 or 2019. So we have that going for us, but just trying to make the parallels so people can understand kind of similar, what does that mean? So there was a lot of people. So while we did welcome 30,000 people through the Underground Railroad, when people did want to continue to come to Canada for a better life, our immigration policy was not designed for people of color. It was, again, more focused on the European Caucasian ancestry. Between 1914 and 1918, Black Canadians served on the home front and abroad in World War II. There was actually the No. 2 Construction Battalion, which was the first and only all-Black battalion in the Canadian military history. But that's because it was segregated. So while it's kind of cool, it's also not kind of cool because finally, Black Canadians were allowed to permitted to serve in the military. So up until that point, if you were Black in Canada, you couldn't join the military. So during this time, you could finally join the military, but you were kept within, all the Black people were kept to their own battalion. So in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan formed groups in various parts of Canada. So a lot of people don't realize that either. A lot of people think those hate groups kind of exist outside of our borders, but in fact, that's not true. There was a lot of cross burnings in Canada. There was one woman in Upper Canada who was engaged to a Black man. The Ku Klux Klan didn't agree with that, with race mixing, so they broke into their home and kidnapped the woman to try to take her away to keep her from marrying this Black man. Also, in recent history, I'm sure lots of people have heard about the Proud Boys, especially with the Capitol riot that just happened in the States, and the fact that Canada has come out and considers them a terrorist organization. That group was actually founded by a Canadian. So it's 2021, and Proud Boys, which is a huge white supremacist group and hate group, was started by a Canadian. So, and there's actually a recent article out on CBC not that long ago that hate groups are on the rise in Atlantic Canada. So these are things that are happening here and happening around us and happening now. And these are things to be mindful of because, like Maya Angelou says, when you know better, you do better. And I really think that the conversation that's really happening around Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement and all kinds of those things are really meant to be educational moments. So these are moments where we can know better so that we can do better. So as I move through life, my experience is not going to be the same as someone else's. And so it's important to think that if you are someone who is white, that just because you're able to move through life in a certain way doesn't mean that someone who's Black is moving through having that same experience. So even myself, I'm biracial, but for the most part, I'm what some people call white passing. And so my experience moving through life is not the same as someone with a much darker skin tone. But in saying that, I have experienced some horrible racism in my life. And so my experience is not as free from that as it may be for someone I know that's white. So again, that's why I wanted to kind of come out with this piece about Black history in Canada, give people some opportunities to learn more so they can know more and do more and be better. So in saying that, let's keep the conversation going. So in 1946, Viola Desmond was arrested for sitting in the whites only section of a movie theater in Nova Scotia. A lot of people know that story, especially a lot of Atlantic Canadians. And now it's very cool. We have her on our $10 bill to commemorate that. The interesting thing about that, so that was in New Glasgow, that movie theater, and Viola Desmond was actually not the only Black woman arrested at that theater. That theater actually had a history of it. There was another woman who was arrested there. I believe her and her son refused to sit in the Black section. And later on, that woman actually started a newspaper. And when she heard about Viola Desmond getting arrested, she actually put Viola Desmond on the front of her newspaper to kind of draw attention to the fact that this had happened. So interesting little fact and tidbit there. In 1964, Africville was demolished. So the media kept referring to Africville as an American-style ghetto. So Africville, for those of you who know the Halifax area, if you know when you're driving along between the two bridges, there used to be an old sign there. It might be a newer sign now because I do believe they restored the church there. But there used to be a little sign there that said Africville, and a lot of people didn't understand what that meant. So there was a community there and of Black Canadians that lived in that area, and for whatever reason, Halifax didn't develop it infrastructurally. So there was no water, there was no electricity, all these kind of things. And so over the years, the media started to pick up on it and said it was like an American style ghetto. And this started to embarrass the city of Halifax. And they decided to take the land back. And so they literally just went in, told everybody bye. A lot of people actually arrived and their belongings had been loaded into dump trucks. And things were just carted off and plowed down because the city of Halifax became embarrassed. They thought it was an eyesore when technically, had they taken the responsibility and actually, attached it to the power grid and the water supply and things like that, then it wouldn't have been in the condition it was in. But instead of doing that at that point in time, they just shipped everybody out. Once again. So again, this is only in the 60s. And of course, obviously more recently, I think people have recalled the city has apologized for the treatment of Africville. And now they're looking to kind of create a somewhat historic site or museums and things like that. So that's something you can check out. Hopefully the bubble will be back in place. So that could be a trip you take when you go to Halifax next time. Maybe you'll check out Africville. In 1983, the last racially segregated school in Nova Scotia was closed. So legal segregation in schools ended in 1954 in Nova Scotia, but the actual school, one of the schools that was built to be racially segregated, they didn't close their doors until 1983. So similar again to what we saw with Indigenous communities, where the last residential school in Canada didn't close until the 90s. There was actually still a racially segregated school open in the 80s in Canada. So kind of after all that super heavy, not super cheery history, I wanted to talk about ways you can celebrate Black History Month. So you should attend a virtual Black History Month event, buy from Black-owned businesses, support Black-led organizations, discover Black Canadian artists, read Black Canadian authors, listen to Black Canadian musicians, and learn more about Black Canadian history. So whether that's from your community you live in, the province you live in, nationally or internationally, a lot of times what we hear about is the international piece of Black history, but it's really important to know we have a rich and diverse amount of Black history here in Canada, especially in Atlantic Canada. So take some time to learn about what that is like. So it's not just what you get from the media or what you get from American sources, that you also take a bit to learn about Canadian Black history. So I've included some resources here. So the Government of Canada, the Canadian Heritage section, they have a Black History Month resource. So there's the New Brunswick, Black History Society. CBC actually has a really cool part on their website, on their news portion about being Black in Canada. That is an ongoing segment. They also have an Indigenous segment on there as well. But if you're looking for what is it like to be a Black person in Canada today across the country, there's a variety of different stories and studies and research available in that area on the CBC website. There's also Black Lives Matter in New Brunswick, the education project. So this was kind of cool. It launched on February 1st. It's a partnership between Black Lives Matter New Brunswick and the University of New Brunswick. So it's actually about taking a look at what's being taught in social studies classrooms between K and 12 to figure out where the gaps are and be able to provide adequate and appropriate Black history in those programs to make sure like that there isn't any glaring omissions. So that's actually something that's pretty cool. You can kind of check it out at that website. There's also the Canadian Encyclopedia Black History Timeline. So a lot of what I talked about tonight is from that timeline, but there's also a considerable amount of additional information because there's obviously I tried to keep mine to Atlantic Canada and the Maritimes. So there's a ton more information out there that's available. So feel free to check that out. So I want to kind of bring it back on a personal note. So I started on a personal note and I want to end it on a personal note. So again, let's take this back to my great-grandfather. So when he and my great-grandmother found out that she was pregnant, he went out and bought a rocking chair. I don't know why that keeps disappearing. Anyways, and so this rocking chair has been passed down over the years. And as you can see from these pictures, not really in super great condition. So it ended up split and we did some sad attempts to try to glue it together. Anyways, and that dark color is not the actual color of the wood. That's just from years and years of people just reapplying stain and varnish and all that fun stuff. So when COVID happened, actually, one of my colleagues, Harry Grant, he, as a hobby, likes to work with wood. And so he took on the astronomical project of trying to restore this rocking chair for me. So as you can see, once you took off the varnish and the stain layers, like the wood is actually quite light. And he was able to repair the split and everything in the seat. And so as you can see these photos here, I now have this, it's in the room with me right now, actually in my office. And it's fully restored and hopefully ready for another 100 years. So the chair itself is over 100 years old. And so hopefully it's ready for another 100 years and several more generations for it to be passed down. So I want to thank you guys for joining me tonight. It's greatly appreciated. I hope I was able to give you some information that perhaps you didn't know before. If you have any questions, feel free to post them. If I don't know the answers, I'll try to find them for you. And please just keep having these conversations, keep the conversation going, keep things moving forward well beyond February. It was important to me that it's timely to talk about this now in February, but obviously this is something I talk about well outside of it and will continue to do so. So thank you again for joining me. I really appreciate your time. I hope you're doing well and that everyone you know is doing well. And we'll see you again soon. So have a great night. Bye.